So I was invited on the basis of offering to make some suggestions. This is really a wonderful work, Giuliano, so thank you very much. Now, there are two lines of development that I'd like to follow, and then some smaller points maybe, or we can do those privately if that feels better. One thing, you know Sydney Mintz very well, obviously, but it's not just about consumption, it's also about production, and I think it could be very useful to trace the history of sugar through the whole world system, right? Because I've been using this, some of Mintz's pictures even, the ones he took for, this is the book Sweetness and Power. Most people will know that. What's so amazing is that factory production began not in England, but in slave plantations. And that has to be relevant to your story somehow, right? And it has partly to do with the technical requirements of sugar and the speed, but there was an industrial discipline as well as an organization around the machinery of milling that was possible because of slavery, complete control of the workforce. And I would love to see how you would develop that. So I'll take that a little in two different directions, maybe not too systematically. So one has to do with labor relations and the petty commodity production, reproduction. I'll do that second. Following on in the Mintz suggestion is to think, well, Phil McMichael and I once said if we ever wrote anything more on food regimes, we'd start with sugar and make that the first regime. Right? And I have been doing a little of that in some other work, but not the full picture, and so I'm hoping you'll do it. Just to say, I don't know if Mintz says this, but I have read it, I think from some other world systems, literature, Dale at Binghamton. Yeah. Slavery in the Circuit of Sugar is the name of the book. Sorry, brain's not working. He talks about the slave resistance taking the form of somehow, if the slave owner went too far in these French colonies that he's looking at, that he would find dead cattle in the morning. And I was reminded of that with your malicious field burning. So there's something about the continuum of free and unfree labor here, and forms of production and forms of resistance that'll also connect to the migrant stories, I think. Then I would suggest, sugar was not a huge crop in the United States with slavery, but it was in Louisiana, which I know pretty well. Cotton was much bigger for slavery. But the abolition of slavery, especially in cotton, less in sugar, in the US, led to sharecropping. Now, in the Caribbean, they brought in Asian indentured workers to replace slaves after they were freed. This was not true in the US, and what you got instead was a system of sharecropping, which I would suggest would be interesting for you to think about in relation to this household production, because it's a kind of contract farming, right? So people were completely dependent. They rented the land, and they were completely dependent for inputs, for purchases, and so on. And so it was a system of where there's an intersection of household production with a control that based on a single crop. Then I started wondering, I was thinking, well, what happened to sugar since then, right? And one of the things that happened, I mean, the whole world market for sugar, as for other commodities, went into crisis in the 1920s and 30s. Then what happened in the US-centered food regime, which included the Common Agricultural Policy, and I wrote about this as a substitution of sugar in the global south, or the third world as it was then, as it was called. It's always been the same thing. It's just called something different, which matters. That there were two kinds of substitution. There was a substitution that was geographic with beet sugar, which is a northern crop, so in Europe and in the US. And that cane sugar the price kept going down and down and down. And so when people were trapped in it, and then many stories get complicated around Brazil, what happened with the MST when they tried to shift and diversify. It's really hard to get out of sugar. But the price was always going down, and the relations of production are always very, constrained, right? In various ways. So I think there's this history of sugar, and it may have to do with the nature of the crop, and you're already talking about that you could make a more continuous historical thread. And then there was a substitution, and this gets really interesting. The substitution in the 1950s and 60s in the industrial system, as sugar became more and more integrated into the durable foods complex, rather than being mainly for table sugar, it got replaced by the byproduct of corn for animal feed, so high fructose corn syrup, and then they developed these synthetics, aspartame, that sort of thing. That was a Monsanto product, so this was all very linked in the industrial and corporate organization. So what's happening now, I thought, whoa, how come the price of sugar is going up? Why is it so interesting? And you're asking that too. If I put it in this longer historical picture, when you talk about flex crops, I have a little reservation about that, using that term, because it's always been there. Since capital, if you look at William Cronin and the way that every part of the cattle was used, right, and that the ability, or Goodman, Sorge, and Wilkinson from 1990s, so they really talk about how capital makes these things fluid, how it incorporates the material properties of the plant or the food or whatever it is, and works with it in complex ways. But it is interesting that it's now intersecting with the energy complex. So I think it gets it more specific than saying it's flexible. It's to say, how is it flexible in each historical moment? So now, these different ways of energy, ethanol, I think, is subsidized, usually. It is in North America and Europe, and it's required, to be used in certain proportions. So it's very government-centric, and that might be worth making that point, and especially because it's so contentious now. Are they now indirectly connected to an attempt to preserve automobiles and the use of fossil fuels in that politics of attempting to shift to sustainable energy? So that would be one question, but then the other question, of course, is using the biomass for energy, which is maybe part of the alternative side. I don't know. These things weave, but it seems to me getting really specific about that, because of course that's going to be the foundation of talking about the sugar frontier, like where it came from, and also when it will stop. When will sugar? It will. Every frontier has its life and its death, and that might be worth looking at as a potential opening for different forms of something new to emerge, or resistance, or alternatives. I don't know. That's one line. So now the other line is following commodities, household production, reproduction. I'd suggest about Polanyi that, you probably already do this, but you didn't today, that when you talk about Polanyi, land, labor, and money as fictitious commodities are really central, and that could help organize the story a little more. And that Bernstein's idea of commoditization, I think, would help you condense more some of the different things you were saying about, because the way I remember that concept, it's an ugly word. It's really different from commodification. Commoditization is the entry into the household of commodity relations. So reproduction. If you just sell your commodities, but you're growing your own food and then you buy things with the money you get, but you're still autonomous to a certain degree if it hasn't penetrated. But once, not only your means of subsistence, but even more your means of production then become commoditized. And that is a conceptual thing, and that allows you to ask a historical question, which I think is the most important question of our period for everything, which is debt. So you're working on that. So debt was crucial to sharecropping back in the 19th century, but now debt is permeating everything. Students, credit cards, mortgages. It becomes the way that control is exercised very deeply in the society. And for Origi, it is the moment of crisis, and that we don't seem to be exiting yet, right? And it's vulnerable, and we have financial crises all the time, but will we exit from that? I don't know, and what would that exit look like, you know? But at the moment, indebtedness, in a cycle, we're in another cycle, right, of indebtedness. And so the history of sharecropping and that kind of debt would be a moment in a cycle, and now we're in another moment, which possibly is deeper and wider, of debt as the mechanism of control and exploitation, right? Especially as wage labor shifts and becomes more exploited, but also there's less of it, just quantitatively, right? Fewer people and more people involved in this kind of thing. So the household, just one other little linguistic thing. It's become common, as an elder now in this field, it's become common to use the term commodities to mean those internationally traded commodities, right? And to then say other things aren't, like food. But of course, the Marxist definition and the more theoretically grounded definition is that a commodity is anything that's produced for sale. So we get ourselves kind of confused by getting caught by that language, that only a few things are commodities. They're sold in international markets, and I'm not even sure sugar, it is in a way, but in another way it's not one of those that appears in the commodity index funds that I've looked at. I don't know, I haven't looked that much. It was soy and maize and wheat and rice and oil and minerals, all that, right? So to think about commoditization is really about what's being bought and sold and how deeply it penetrates into the reproduction of the household. And then you can connect that in a way that Henry Bernstein didn't, very much, that I know of, to gender and age relations and demographic dynamics. I can send you a few things on that from before. And then what I totally love that you're doing is the ecological dimension, and I would love to see you start with it in a way too, you know? So that water, for instance, water becomes a way of understanding the particular, it becomes part of the relations of production of sugar, right? In a deeper way than we're used to. And it would allow you to connect it to other things like fruits and vegetables. California's had a water problem for a long time, right? Mining of water, like mining of soil. And then you could be even more specific, and then it's not just depleting, it's disrupting the water cycle. So that, and you said it, but you know, just to focus it, right? I don't think I'm saying much that's new, but instead of talking about resilience as an abstract thing, just like not talking about maybe flex crops as an abstract thing, to get really concrete, right? So you have it in the back of your mind, but really what's happening is that the rain is not falling in that place because the forests have been cut down to grow the sugar, right? And that gives a much more concrete feeling, which is consistent with the very beautiful ethnographic work that you're doing. So those are really my main points. I think that, yeah, that's it. I'd love to talk more. No, I'd love to hear more.
I agree. I don't know why you talk more.
Thanks for the opportunity and patience.
Maybe you can ask another question, or do you prefer to answer?
Just let me elaborate a little bit. Harriet's comment was very, was more a discussion of my presentation, but great, honored. Yes, world system. I mean, I think the first phrase you put on table, I think it's very important for me, the idea of, again, tracing this historical trajectory of how sugar started in the longue durée is something that is really here on the back of my mind. But it has been really, increasingly difficult to start a venture. I mean, of course, we know that sugar started in the Caribbean. One of the key moments of the boom of sugar was the Caribbean, was the triangular slave trade. I think it's Jason Moore in his last book, 7 Cheap Things. He has an introduction in which he gives a little bit, again, this trajectory showing how even before the triangular slave trade, you had sugar plantations in Spanish colonies in North and West Africa. And this is definitely connected to the question of labor. So I think I should do more historically. Because I have methodologically history and understanding the historical development is fundamental. And I always this is definitely one issue I should try to engage with, and not having the story starting with colonialism, right? Because often we say this is wrong, but we end up doing the same. I try to do something in relation to that. So yeah, I'm not entirely guilty, but I think you are absolutely right. That's that looking at the way in which sugar develops, not only in Africa, but how the development it has taken in Africa is part of a larger trajectory and more encompassing sets of transformation. I think it's very important. So thank you for this comment, because I think it's incredibly important. Then there are these two things. So where frontier starts and where do they end? This could be one way to try and trace this trajectory, right? Because I also have a feel that, for example, in Busoga, that we are reaching a crisis point. The crisis can be, again, coming from protests, but also coming from very low prices, skyrocketing defaults for farmers, growing costs of production for companies. So I have a sense that, that the fact, for example, that Ugandan and Tanzanian government are increasingly putting their hands on sugar, so this is becoming a government thing, can further go into this, in the exploration of this trajectory. So for example, in another paper, I did not have the time or the connections to mention. I was kind of tracing the fact that in Uganda we had a strong mobilization, was called the Walk to Work protest. And this was basically a protest, national protest, perhaps the largest protest with Museveni in power, so the largest protest for 30 years. And the key element that had kind of triggered this protest was the rising cost of sugar. So if you hear a declaration of activists and people that were, so they were concerned about the rising cost of fuel and transport, but sugar was, sugar for consumption. So we are talking of urban poor, right, who really suffer if the price of sugar. So my understanding is that sugar is becoming increasingly political in the sense that the government needs to manage something that can trigger food riots, for example. Uganda has been at the core of, really escalating food riots connected to the rising price of banana plantain, they call it matoke, and sugar. So I think there is something, at least the end point. I need to understand more about the starting point of the frontier, but I can already see the kind of sunsetting of the sugar frontier. So that's. You were also mentioning the price of sugar has been consistently, has been low. So now it's coming up. Where does it come from? Well, I think it comes from the fact that now, I think you are right when you say it has always been there, right? For example, when sugar was produced in the Caribbean, you had refined sugar coming, but you also rum being produced, right? And that was the beginning, and this was also, refineries, sugar refineries in the US connected to slavery. There is a lot of historical records on this, so this should not be. But then the question of why it's now growing, the price, it's a little bit tricky because you still have a heavily subsidized production in the US, in Europe less than before, but still heavily. But I think that, I don't want to reason just in terms of demand and supply, but there is a growing demand for sugar. There is a growing demand for sugar, for example, in BRICS countries, for example, but you don't need necessarily to go at BRICS countries. Again, if you see for volumes of sugar consumption, you find many African countries there, many countries from Southern Africa. Right, so I don't know, I think all this question needs to be somehow kind of slightly repackaged and but then there is a second question which I really would like suggested, because I am a political economist, let's put it like this, and I think also the presentation is substantially coming from agrarian political economy. Then I also try to engage with some ecological questions because you cannot disconnect them. But methodologically speaking, I'm not sure how to proceed in bringing together a political economy focus and a political ecology. As you said should come first, they should come in the same moment, right? They should come together.
I think you're on the edge of it. Somehow you are.
I'm still, I'm not fully. I think that's why I'm now reading more Jason Moore, because it allows a conceptualization of the dynamics of capital accumulation and social reproduction, which cannot keep out the question of nature, right? But not only the question of nature. He also mentioned unpaid women labor, which are two things unpaid women labor is the feminist critique to Marx's take of agrarian change, right? In some ways. Many argue forgetting the gender dynamic. So I think I'm still struggling a bit, but I think I'm doing some steps, slow steps.
Let me suggest a way in.
Yeah.
And this is something I haven't done yet, but I think we all need to do it, and it's from political economy. Somehow we have lost the balance that was there. Even if you read development, not the World Bank now, but the same development discourse from the 1950s and 60s, or the history of agriculture that was done in those periods. It's land and labor. And we kind of lose the land a bit, and then we bring it back in, and now it comes back in as ecology. But we can start with that land, and as it was then, which was not ecologically informed, it was just property, right? Pieces of property that were either big and rented, or small and owned or rented, or whatever, right? And they would talk about how much arable land there is in a country or in a region. No one cared too much in what I was reading about forests or water. But now, I guess the ideas I'm working with that I'd be interested to see if you think they're useful is the distinction between land as property and landscape as the shape of a territory as it is reshaped from its natural features through as a joint production of humans and the features they encounter of the water, of the soil, of the climate, the trees, all of it, and the wildlife. And so it might be helpful to go back to that land and rethink it as landscape, to bring in what changes are being made when we cut down the forests or pollute the water. Yeah. And finally, looking forward to some better future, possibly, at least in West Africa, so I don't know if anything's happening over here. And in many parts of the world, there's a return of interest in customary tenure and how to think it in relation to rights, gender rights, age rights, individual rights, and find that balance. And so I'm wondering if there's some thing that could, if we trained our eyes, that you would see about a way to recover both the social, in a Polanyi sense again, both the social and the natural embeddedness. Maybe people are trying to, they must be doing something, right, to survive that could point in that direction.
Yeah, that's great. I want to just need a little bit of push, because...
Are we taking this on? Is that...
sorry?
Should other people be talking?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to make a point on the question of debt. Because really this question of debt has been really kind of, in my mind for a lot of time, and I completely share the idea of the commoditization of, Person calls it commoditization of social reproduction.
He just calls it commoditization, and then the definition is commoditization happens when the commodity form, commodity relations
penetrate the household, but he called it, like in his last book, he called it commoditization of subsistence. That's the word.
He changed it there.
Right. But that's my engagement with this Bernstein question, it's a long term, and I've been also talking to him, and my point is not just so my question is, if a farmer does not produce as an agricultural firm to sell and to maximize and all the capitalist logic, is he still producing? It's a question. It's not. Is he still producing commodities? Does the word we should get back to Marx. When Marx says, you can produce whatever you want, but there is always a moment in which you realize, the profit unrealized, and this is the marketplace, right?
Well, before you get to capital, at the very beginning, or before you get to capitalist relations of production, in the second part of volume 1, right, where you have to descend, he sets up the contradiction, right? Commodities are things that are exchanged at value.
Right.
So the question, the contradiction, the dialectic he sets up is how can things exchange at value and yet somebody gets more? And that's where you have to follow Dante,
Right.
to the factory and see that labor is a special kind of commodity. So that exchange is what produces surplus value. So the whole first part is the exchange of commodities in the way Adam Smith talked about it.
Right. But I still think that, I don't know, I mean, I think also Henry conceded some of, so when I was, he came to Makerere to give a seminar, he was invited to many weeks, and he was often, again, coming up with accepting some of the criticisms, because he has been working a lot on Tanzania and South Africa, which are pretty commercial, and he tends to extend this argument to the whole of Africa. And this is a problem also people like Ben Cousin do. Like there is a certain assumption that the social relations we have witnessed in South Africa are somehow moving north. I don't know. I have issues with this notion, also because this notion, he thinks it's a replacement for the category of peasants. He doesn't like the idea of peasants, and he thinks everybody is a petty commodity producer. I'm not entirely accepting this argument, also because when they say, well, every human being needs to reproduce himself through the circuits of capital, I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think this is really Marxist orthodoxy, which doesn't really capture, the fact that people reproduce themselves at different. So how do we explain that? And people reproducing themselves but starving, reproducing themselves but under-consuming, reproducing themselves but not being linked to markets. As there are differentials, I think, and I think it's important to capture these. Of course, if you're using just Marxist theories or methods without any ethnographic sort of sense of what's happening on the ground, then not every category can fit that social reality. So that's so my kind of distinction between I don't, when I say food producer, it's because of the lack of another word rather than commodity producer, or producers of something they need for their own consumption and so on. So that's where my kind of distinction comes.
I completely agree with you, and I've been on your side of the debate with Henry since the 1970s.
Maybe you can you want to add something more? Are you sure? Some other questions?
I'll try, but it's difficult after this session. No, well, thank you for the presentation. First of all, I learned a lot. I was just, I think it's probably a comment and an implicit question to expand on it. You were, at some point, you were describing the way in which extraction of value occurs. You were saying for financial capital, it seems more profitable to invest in other points of the value chains rather than production itself. And you were saying this is a bit paradoxical. Now, you know much better than me the theoretical literature on it, but why is it paradoxical in your view? Because this is something that I've seen in different value chains, and it's just the point where most of the value is appropriated nowadays in many chains. I think about the fruit and vegetable chains. That doesn't contradict the fact that value might be produced in production, no, through labor, and so this is also, I think, I'm not that good at it, but it's also a debate that is going on between Van der Ploeg and others. Where is value produced, how the distribution of value is produced. I think Van der Ploeg says something that food empires have found a way that has made a bit obsolete the understanding of value appropriation and production of the past. But I really, that could be wrong in my reading, but it's an interesting question, I think. And the other one is also related to this, I guess. I guess your case study is fantastic in bringing fresh material to something that I heard from Leandro Vergara Camus. He was going on how to rethink debates in agrarian political economy, and he was basically saying, but let's stop saying that some people are not Marxist and others are more Marxist than others. I think the question is, dynamics of capitalism from above, let's say. So like, the two streams there, which we can broadly say it's McMichael on one side and Bernstein on the other, by simplifying the debate. But essentially there are some people that are putting more emphasis on dynamics from above, so corporations, and others that put more emphasis on internal dynamics of social differentiation. And he was saying maybe the difficult question is how we actually analyze the two of them together. And you were doing it, I think, exactly there, because what you were pointing in terms of value extraction is dynamics of accumulation from above. And then you talk about this possession from below, or it's basically expanded accumulation, no? So it's a process of social differentiation that you described. So as far as I know, Leandro has not published that thing yet. But it's exactly, I think apart from Leandro's work, this is the question in many people, in SOAS or in agrarian political economy are dealing with, and it's, I think your case is interesting. The last thing, which is really, coming back to my personal research interest, I would love to hear more, probably it's something that you can pick up in future work, about the making of this new agricultural working class. To what extent there's a making there. You talk about migrant workers, and if the direction is actually to, this kind of expansion of these new agricultural complexes that involve a lot of labor. Now you're talking of sugar, but other people have analyzed it in oil palms. Are we seeing a wage, at the formation of a new working class? And when I say the making, the obvious reference is Thompson, which has a lot of stories, as what you talk about, fires and struggles, and so this is more my interest, but it's, I think there could be a lot there too, and I would be interested to read your future work on this.
So thank you, Giulio, for the questions. So the first question, I say paradoxical because we have somehow been used to the idea that if you have unlimited access to land, if you're a big company, you have unlimited access to land, you don't pay rent, you don't pay anything like that. We have been somehow driven by the assumption that the land grab debates, despite you had a lot of speculative sort of deals, but the substance of the deals has been in actual agricultural production, at least in Africa. So in Africa you don't see much the idea that land is a store of value. You see more, in speculative terms, but you see land being used. And this is witnessed by the fact that, you also have companies that are trying to expand access to land. So for example, Illovo in Tanzania tries to have more hectares. Now, the fact that instead now we see another trend in which some companies are starting to delegate production and focusing on input provision, seeds, fertilizers, and so on, seems to me some sort of something that has to do with the risks that are involved in the actual production. So let me give you another example. Even large companies like Kagira Sugar Works that have 10,000 hectares of land to produce it in their own way, they do not have all the land irrigated. Why? Well, because in some discounters you have never got investments in irrigation. So last year you had a huge drought, and even the company suffered enormous losses for a variety of reasons. So the idea here is that I'm not sure again that the financialization is only witnessed, like, I don't know, for example, Fairbairn argument. It's about this. Capital, is moving, now to finance capital is moving to land because of speculative reasons. I think that here, finance capital is kind of controlling some key points in the agricultural production cycle, and these are the points where you get more profits and you have a lesser risk. So they control, again, fertilizers, they control the market of seeds, and I see actually that the financialization we are seeing is not just this speculation sort of thing, but this finance capital controlling, the agribusiness circuits in ways that are unprecedented. That's the argument I'm trying to make, which is sometimes in line with Isaacson, but other times in disagreement with him, right? So that's the point. So I'm trying to characterize it as a financialization of the productive activities, not just as financialization, seen as a form of speculation of just a rising value with no added value issue. You see the point? So that's why I call it paradoxical, because it expressed a new trend, which only few people are starting to grapple with. And again, the graph I showed with the outgrowers, it's revealing, right? You see the company giving out land, you take it, up to the point of becoming incredibly dependent on the functioning of the mill. And then there is the question. I want to answer the third question, because I think there is very little labor very little work on farm labor. Like we in the land grab debate, the labor issue has been overlooked. To say the least. And we have a lot of emphasis on land, on properties, on enclosures, accumulation by dispossession, but labor, very little, right? We have our colleague Elisa Greco, who is perhaps one of the few people who try to work on farm labor. So if I can couple what she's arguing and what I'm seeing in this case, well, I'm not sure if this is already the making of a working class, but clearly there is some sort of embryonic development there with farmers, with workers demonstrating actually kind of wildcat strikes, which make us see some sort of resemblance to other forms of mobilization and strike, which is something very, we have difficulties in imagining African plantation workers demonstrating, right? In the sense that we don't really capture what's happening, the struggles that are surrounding labor. We are mostly interested in the struggles that are surrounding farmers. And we often ignore this, but we often ignore again that smallholders themselves are those who in many ways contribute to attracting migrant workers that end up working for less money on smallholders' farms, but less exploitative terms, because when you are under the control of a big company, your working conditions and your times of work can be even worse than when you work for a smallholder. But nonetheless, right, the question of the labor relations in family farming is often missing, right? So I think that all this flow of scholarship that is trying to recenter the land grab debate, to use Tanya Lee argument, recentering the labor debate in the land grab literature, I think it's incredibly important. Not sure if this is this signals the making of a working class. Thompson talks of this making of a working class as a whole series of cultural processes which are quite difficult to penetrate, at least at this stage of the research, and of course without the idea of exploring them in all its kind of cultural components of the making of a working class. But again, I think that the labor question, the question of exploitation, the gendered character of labor, all these dynamics are absolutely crucial. If this is signaling or not the making of a working class, I really don't know. But clearly there is an important element of newness here when you see, again, workers with their syndicates and trade unions, trying to negotiate a little bit and show some sort of agency, which and I think it's kind of a generalized moment of conflicts, because you see also farmers who have been generally very docile vis-a-vis the company, to trying and starting to make some more kind of muscular sort of protest, which rarely happen, right? So in fact, there was a moment in which I was thinking, you give them 75% of the sugar they need. If you stop, they stop working, but you're still complaining because of say low sugar cane prices. So what is it that you're missing here? And of course, again, this is connected to what I was saying, how these outgrowers associations have been depoliticized, right? And they do not make anymore the interest of workers or of farmers, but they seem more again as intermediaries that mediate the imperatives of the company with the organization. I think that's
on this.
Excuse me.
I would actually steal the suggestion that Harriet did 2 days ago. So, yes, starting from farm work, but there's also workers in the mills and other parts of the chain. So it would be interesting to look at, labor in agro-food more generally, also in this emerging, whatever, complexes or, yeah. I find it very interesting, and I think also what you were bringing out, I think this kind of continuance of the free unfree, these are ways to fragment the working class controlling. I think so. You were actually at some point just hinting about the recruitment systems. Now, for those who are more familiar with the literature on Europe or Latin America, fruit and vegetable, the recruitment system is key also to the way in which it prevents possible mobilization. We are in Italy, and caporalato is the issue on the table since a long time. So that was a passage I was, my ears were widening. And this is interesting, then of course there's a limit to what we can do, but perhaps some of your students can take up the question. That would be super interesting.
I'm just gonna, also because you put that image at the end of all of those candies and sweet things that are being sold locally, I think, right? Yes. I know there's a limit to what you can do, what anybody can do, and yet to have these things in mind as the whole context within which things happen, it's probably worth noting that the change in diets and the push to change them on the consumption side by the supermarkets is part of this story. And Sidney Mintz has some interesting, just minor comments that I think are really helpful, and some of his other work about changing diets, about the addictive quality of sugar as well, that it was one of those colonial drugs along with opium and tea and coffee and so on that were brought in the first phase of colonialism and the creation of the first working classes, or the emergence of the first working classes. And so that is the other side of the shift in reproduction. and to add the perhaps transitional or critical moment at the household level, Mintz also, I can give you the reference on this, somewhere else he talks about the formal qualities of every agrarian society before the transformation into capitalism. And they can have markets and sell things and buy things, but that when the food, the cuisine is connected to the agronomy, and you're really verging on all this here, you know, with what's the sugarcane doing in the fields instead of the beans, and you know, that there are three elements of formal elements of every great agrarian civilization, and they fit together, the agronomy and the cuisine. So he calls it the core fringe legume pattern. Core legume fringe, because that's the order of importance. So the core is a starchy staple. It's either a grain or a tuber, like a potato. The legume is the protein, the plant protein, which is the basis of most people's protein in their diet, and also the nitrogen-fixing plant. And the fringe is everything else. It's all the other things that grow in the field or are gathered in the forest or in the animals, or, you know, and it's a very, I find that just a very rich way of thinking about subsistence in a, let's call it an ecological way, an adjacent Moore way that includes human nature as well as what's going on in the field. And so to watch that disruption at both sides, at the agronomic side and at the diet side, yeah, I like to think of cuisines integrated or disrupted, right? And that there's a history too of sugar in that disruption that's related to the other side of the working class formation. Yeah.
Maybe we can just close here and continue at lunch if there are not other questions. Just to continue at lunch, I wonder if you have considered or analyzed this kind of transformation in West Africa too, that is quite a different context compared with Eastern Africa, and in Northern Africa. That is what we have considered in some of our debate and exchange with other colleagues. Thank you.